Let's do it. Hello, wonderful people of WonderCon at home. Welcome to the Fiction and Features Telling Functional Stories and Games panel. My name is Justin Kruger. My pronouns are he, him. And we thank you for taking the time to watch our panel. We realize you have tons of quarantine time to spend, and we're glad you're here with us. I usually spend it watching Netflix, but we're really happy that you are spending your time with us here. Obviously, we can't be there in person. We would love to see all of your beautiful faces, but you know, this panel is going to be pre-recorded, so we're not going to be able to answer your questions live. But please, please, please feel free to tweet at us as the panel is going on or after the panel with any questions that you may have. We want this to be interactive. But during this panel, we are talking about how story impacts video game design. Video games are such an amazing art form for telling stories, but unlike more passive mediums, games require active participation from the players to progress the story. By necessity, games have to teach the players how to do the thing, and whether you can notice the story or not, it greatly influences and impacts your actions and decisions. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and we have an amazing panel, amazing guests here today. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Please, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourselves?
Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Eggs. I'm currently a freelance writer in the games industry. I've worked for studios like BioWare, Insomniac Games, Gearbox, Activision, just a bunch of studios across the industry. And I also write comics and graphic novels. My latest book is called Tell No Tales. It's about cool queer pirates. And I write a lot for Marvel, like the Unstoppable Wasp novel and the Marvel Action Captain Marvel comics. So big, just dork stuff all around for me.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Jill Scharr, she, her. I am a project lead writer at Harebrained Studios in Seattle, and I have previously worked at Bungie on the Destiny franchise.
She, her as well. I totally forgot about that, sorry.
Hey y'all, my name is Milo. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a game producer and writer currently working as a production coordinator at Infinity Ward, but I've also done a little bit of writing at Insomniac on Spider-Man Miles Morales and at Blizzard on Heroes of the Storm.
I'm next. I'm Josh Foreman. I'm a he, him, and so I've been in the video game industry as an artist and designer for 26 years, and places like ArenaNet, Moon Studios, and currently at Mythical. In addition to that, I've been building my own franchise of novels that hopefully will someday become TV shows, movies, and stuff starring these kind of cool guys. I also do sculpting, so I have fun making the book covers for fun books like this, The Scarred King. You can get it on Amazon today. Okay, and yeah, I'm super excited about this because I love every manifestation of storytelling in different mediums has a different flavor to it, and I'm really excited about that. Sorry, I'm gonna stop mumbling. Next, Charles.
Hi, I'm Charles Beacham. I am a huge Star Wars nerd, big fan, obviously. But professionally, I've worked in comics as an editor at Marvel. Worked on a lot of titles from Black Panther to the Inhumans to the Star Wars books. And I made my way into video games as a narrative editor for Activision, working on the Destiny franchise. And helped launch comic books there for Bungie and Activision. And now I'm a writer with Mythical Games, working on a really cool project called Blanco's Block Party. And we'll probably talk more about that later. But yeah, I'm excited to be here as well. And glad to be here with all my friends on Zoom as, you know, the year of Zoom.
Yeah, this is a dream panel of mine with people who have worked on some games that I absolutely love. So I can't wait to get into some of the questions that I have for you guys. Starting off, this is going to be an open question. Anybody can jump in. In your experience, what role does story play in teaching players how to play the game?
I'll jump in. that's a for me as someone who loves story, right? Like I think that for lots of us, like the reason that we love movies or video games or whatever it is, right? The reason we got into this work is because the way that stories made us feel, right? I think for me, stories in games are pretty essential. Like I think about a game like Breath of the Wild, right? Like the story of that game is so impactful and so seamless with teaching you from the beginning, like, oh, you're coming awake in this shrine, and oh, you've got to use this artifact to go and find things. And without the story, that mechanic of going and finding things and using the tablet to go and discover the world is cool, but it doesn't have that same depth. So really, to me, like the story and learning process they work pretty hand in hand. They're inseparable.
Yeah, it's almost like the game mechanics are the how to play the game, but the story is the why you're playing the game. Like it's why are you pressing these buttons? Why are you doing these things? Why should you be emotionally invested in this, or else every game would just be the same set of buttons over and over again. And I also think we could do an entire 45-minute panel just on how to make a good tutorial. Like that's that question is like overwhelming for me to even start to think about, and I'm like, I can't answer that in a very soundbitey way. But I would say that it's like story provides the context to the actions that you're doing with your on the sticks, and every game has different context. And without that, even in games that are like battle royales, like Apex Legends, which I'm obsessed with, the story or the context is the characters as opposed to like maybe a more narrative plot line. But I think that also totally counts and is equally as investing. If my 600 hours last year in the game are a testament to that. It was a pandemic.
Hey, don't need to justify your pandemic play hours. I've sunk way too much time in all these games I'm playing.
I like to think of separating out these three words: narrative, plot, and story. Not that anyone agrees on what those three things mean. Like, look it up on the internet. No one agrees on what those mean. But to me, having them separated conceptually is really helpful, because you can apply something like a narrative framework to literally anything. Take the game Pac-Man, right? It's like you're this little weird shaped thing, but there's ghosts and they're chasing you through a maze. And it's like, that's a narrative framework. It doesn't have plot really, except, I'm running away from things. But then you could extend that further in abstraction. There's a game called Thomas Was Alone, where you're literally like a little block, right? And all of the plot and narrative and framing has to do with your interactions with other shapes, and somehow personality is imbued in them through narration. And that narration is providing something different, right? It's not providing plot, but it's providing narrative framework. So yeah, all of these things, like a lot of people, when they hear the word story, they think linear edited narrative, which is like, this happened, then this happened, then we're going to cut to this next thing because the stuff in between was boring. And video games are just so different. They disrupt all that. So.
Yeah,
I think, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think I want to jump on the word context, because I totally agree with that. I think like ideally a story provides the context for the rules, and like a good story will let the player not only understand the rules, but intuit the rules, because you sort of start to understand what world you're operating in and what the rules of the universe you're in are. Like, can I jump onto this ledge? Well, am I like a super powered person, or do I have a jetpack, or am I like a normal person? That helps you sort of assess what it's capable, what the rules of this world are. And then, what the character you're playing as, what they want, that's going to be related to the game's objectives, to the goals of the drive of the game. So yeah, I like what Sam said about, the rules are the what, and the narrative is the why. They're sometimes it is worthwhile to break them out, but ultimately they fuse together, and they're the rules and the narrative are very intertwined. They can be the same thing.
It's as you're talking, Jill, I couldn't help but think about like some of those most impactful games are the ones where it's not necessarily narrated to you or told to you explicitly, right? Like, oh, this is what you have to do, or this is how the world works. It's that kind of journey, that discovery of, oh, my character can do this. Like if I jump off of this thing, I don't die. Like I just fall infinitely and then I respawn back. You know, like that kind of stuff is unique to games, in that we can let the player discover what's happening or what they can do. Whereas in a comic or in a book or in a movie, it's like, nope, here's the thing. It's very much, here's what happens.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I mean, death. Sorry, yeah, like even just how a player should feel about dying in a game, like narrative can have, because are you really dead, or is it like a canonical death? You know, like a game like Zelda, it's not a canonical death, versus like a roguelike where it's expected that you're going to die a bunch of times, and so but because roguelikes are a relatively new genre to, or I don't write that check, but I feel like sometimes I come into a roguelike and I feel like, why am I dying so much? Do I just suck at this game? And then if the narrative can tell me, oh no, we expect you to die a bunch of times, and here's a little bit of story about like the new character you're playing as or whatever, it really helps like you would bring in the new rules and reassess your framework for success, for how to play the game.
The afterlife of all these characters is a mystery for some. Sometimes it's explained. I worked on a game called Trials, where you found out at the end that all the bikers that you've killed in the past were just clones. So, I think that question is really interesting. Moving on to something that Sam mentioned about onboarding, where we could spend an entire 45 minutes talking about onboarding. I think. I'm curious to know, how do you onboard a player without making it feel like a tutorial? How do you avoid making the early moments of that game feel too much like school?
For me, it's all about like delivering emotional and character context like immediately. So setting up the like core characters and emotional stakes of the game like right away, so that even as the game is teaching you and press X to jump, you're doing that because you are getting away from someone who's trying to kill your family or whatever. Like you have to make the character care, you have to make the player care about the character immediately, or at least understand their circumstances and why they should and hopefully will care as quickly as possible, or else it's just like jumping around in a gray box, which devs do all the time, but it's not super interesting.
I feel like so much stuff that both Charles and Jill mentioned too earlier like relates to this, where it's like so much of tutorialization and understanding a mechanic is experiential with the player, where it's like they just need to try it out and like see what it feels like for themselves. Like how in Mario, like you get controls and like prompts at the beginning and you get that initial context, but then all of the initial levels will be like these large open spaces that give you just like a lot of time to like pivot and sort of like understand the mechanics that you're like working with in the world. I think it's about understanding where you need to like tell players how to do something, and then just like letting stop doing the hand holding and just like let them go for it.
I mean, I feel like any of you guys have probably heard me talk about this game a billion times because I love it, but ICO, right? Like that game has one of the, I feel like it's such a sneaky first time user experience that is, and it's kind of long, but you don't even know that you're learning about the mechanic of the game. At least when I think about it, like I don't feel like I learned about it. It's just like it happened. But like the first, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, those first few puzzles are just you trying to escape from from that first series of cages in the castle, with the darkness coming in and the shadows coming in attacking you, right? And then there's this big beat where it's like, oh, there's a princess in a cage up there. Like I've got to get her out, right? And then you get the princess out, but then from then on, you have to hold her hand, or you can't, or you can let her go and solve puzzles, but you have to stay close enough to protect her the whole time, right? And that's the whole trick of Ico. Like that's the entire game. But the way that you're taught that doesn't ever feel like, hey, make sure you hold her hand. It's just, if you get too far away, you die, right? Like you lose. And that was so, like, it's just so great the way that they did that. And it's just, you're learning and discovering that along the way. It never felt like school, like you said, Justin.
Yeah, all of those games by Fumito Ueda have that sense of like very minimal plot, but very rich and deep and textured narrative, which again, my own headcanon definition of those words, right? Where it's like you are experiencing these emotions and thoughts and well, it's an emotional journey through them, but it is delivered through mechanics and through intuiting what you should do based on the environmental storytelling, which is my favorite thing ever.
I'm just so glad you keep bringing up the difference between narrative and plot, because like I'm just gonna like air some grievances here. Here we go. They're coming out. But there's this weird obsession among like a lot of executives, I think, in games with plot and having like a really twisty plot, and every mission has to have a twist that you don't see coming, and there needs to be something unexpected, and the plot has to be really complicated, or players
like
won't feel engaged.
Ever since Lost, that is
I
like
know.
every
M. Night
executive
Shyamalan, like,
marching
crushed
orders. They're like,
our
everything has to
brains.
be mystery box. And it's like,
I know, and it's just not the case. Like, it's just, when I play a game, I don't care. I'm going to be honest. I don't really care about the plot. What I care about are the characters. Like, the characters are if I care about them, no matter what happens to them, I'm going to be invested. And what I come away from the game remembering is how I felt about the characters and their relationships to each other. I played Dragon Age Inquisition 1,000 times, and I could not tell you what that game is about. But I could tell you like every single detail of my relationship with Iron Bull, like to the nth degree, essentially. And so there's just like, Games has this weird obsession with like Robert McKee's story and Dan Harmon's story circle, and like making things fit in these plot structures that just like, you do there are suggestions.
Yeah,
a good game. Like
I mean, those traditional plot structures are kind of obsolete when it comes to games, and they're limiting, right? Like, because of what you just said, I love what you just said about Dragon Age, right? Like, you don't remember the plot, but you remember your personal relationship, your character's relationship with other characters in the game. And that's because what's important when you're playing the games is the sorry, and I don't know if my definition of these things probably conflicts with yours, Josh, but like to me, narrative is what happened, or the steps that happen. You know, they go from here to here to here, and the things that are that context, right? Story is always the same. My narrative, like the story of today, we all have the same story. What happened, right? But our narrative, the experience that we each have, is individual. And with games, like, that's the beauty of the medium, is every player's experience is going to be different. What playing through Miles Morales means to me, I'm sure is vastly different than what it means to Josh or to Justin or to Jill or to any of you guys, right? But like, that narrative, that experience that I have with that game, or that you have with that game, Sam, like it's individual, and it can't be hindered by the plot. It has to be enriched by the plot and the set design and, you know, the mechanics of the game.
I absolutely love this conversation. I want to focus it a little bit more deeply. You know, when we were talking a lot about plot versus narrative versus story, when does this stuff get defined in the development process? You know, when are you defining the story versus the plot versus the narrative, and you know, what does that process actually look like?
I just saw Sam put her hand over her face, and I empathize with that feeling a lot, because I think sometimes, you know, it is a thing that you have to define with your team, because sometimes we all have vague ideas about what we mean when we say these things, but sometimes you have to like, you know, when you start with a team, say, here's what I mean when I say story, here's what I mean when I say plot, and even you know, what does this particular game prioritize? Because there's so many different kinds of games that games where it makes more or less sense to borrow from that filmic language, like a game like Ico. It doesn't really, because it wants to be more minimalist, or even a game like Dragon Age that wants to be much more branching and take so much longer. It's such a different length of player commitment and relationship, right? Like you're not a movie, you sit down and you watch it in probably one piece. A game that's like 60 hours long, you're not going to do it in one piece. Probably you're going to leave and come back, and it's therefore harder to remember all of the plot elements. And that's why games have things like journals or adventure logs and things like that. But it can be kind of a chore to go back and look at that and read like what was happening. But it's just easier to remember. How do you feel about these characters? Oh yeah, I liked hanging out with this guy, that guy. This was fun. I want to help this person. It's just more intuitive.
And Milo can probably speak more to this too, but so much of when the story is developed in the production process is a consequence of the greater production pipeline. So like we want to say like the story gets figured out right away and then it's done and that's the story we have for the rest of the 6 years of development. Yeah, everyone in the chat is like, absolutely not. Like that kind of happens. And in some ways you kind of have to do that, because when you think about things like performance capture scenes or like cinematic scenes, like sometimes you have to shoot those almost immediately at the start of production because there's so much development time on the back end, because the number of people who have to touch that, from like riggers to lighters to all the people making that scene look like it could be a Pixar film, is just like gigantic. And so your ability to change things like cinematic scenes is really hampered by like money and time. Whereas things, to Jill's point, like non-VO text, like codexes that you read, you can put the game immediately with no overhead fee except for the pain of your writer's hands, like, which is $0. So like, it's hard because you create these cutscenes off the top and then you have 6 years of development. And I don't know if you know how much you have changed in the last 6 years, but I guarantee you it's a lot. And that's how much games change over the course of 6 years, where people are like, this worked then, it doesn't work now, all this stuff is changing. And so the whole game arc might change, but then you have these like 12 cutscenes that you still have to fit into like this story. And maybe it's very hard. It's like this weird puzzle box now. And like, so you try to come up with something in the start, but you know that inevitably it's going to change a lot. But sometimes there are things that can't change. And so you're like, you have to figure that out.
Yeah, it's literally so difficult. It's like, that's like the central conflict I feel, because like half of game design is like iteration and changing things and tweaking things like over a period of time. And then the other half is we have a very specific schedule that needs to happen for this. And like, if we do not take like 2 months to work on this cinematic, we will not have a cinematic. And so it's like, do you decide the story really early or do you like keep iterating on it? I see like so much iteration happening, and then it's like writing touches every single department. Like I feel before it like gets into the game a lot of times. And then it's like, what does that mean for like communication, and then making sure everybody has some sort of clear understanding of the story and the plot for like the parts that they're working on. I feel it's so difficult to maintain.
It's such an, what you just touched on, Milo, is such an interesting point, and really like probably the biggest pain point I see in game development is that iteration is essential to make great games, right? And narrative context is such a rallying point for across disciplines in game development. But at the same time, like when you're trying to lay tracks, like it gets hard to iterate, right? So this balance of, okay, how do we tell a story? How do we give narrative context to everything and keep everyone aligned on what it is we're making and what the vision is for this thing, and still turn out new stuff, turn out a product. It's super tricky, but it's fun. It's what makes it exciting, right?
I think games as an art form are so unique in that sense, where it's different than writing a book or making a movie, where you can kind of have a central narrative through line that you can kind of establish at the beginning, and you can direct all of your forces towards that throughout production. whether it's set design or acting choices, casting, like all that stuff comes together to a direction. Whereas with games, you have the design impetus and the narrative, and the design necessarily evolves as technology evolves, as the marketplace moves forward. We're such a young medium still, so things are always changing on that front, and we have to keep up to remain competitive, which forces the narrative to kind of have to come along. There's this idea of the gestalt, which is where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and you can't just have like one element plus one element plus one element, and that equals 3. It always equals something unknown to everyone. At the beginning, we have no idea where we're going to land, and you just kind of have to be okay with that. I think that's kind of the main crux of the challenge of making games as a narrative medium.
Yeah, Josh, I want to stick with you because as a level designer and on the design side, how does story factor into what you do? Because you're not necessarily writing the story, but there are certain elements that you can do to tell a story in a level.
Yeah, I think the very best level design always comes about in close coordination with the story team, however that team is defined, just to make sure that, because there's this whole language of spatial construction, whether it's architecture or just nature, has all these rules. If you want the player to feel oppressed and sad or exhilarated and powerful, you're going to change the spatial structures that you're in, the height of the cave you're going through, the color of the lights, how open the level is versus the closed, and all of those things are making the player feel a certain way. And when they're resonating with how the character in the game is supposed to feel, that's where you get that real synergy and power going on. And so that's what I strive for. And when those narrative beats are just kind of not provided at the beginning, that's when you get kind of wishy-washy level design.
It's really interesting. Now, on the flip side, Sam and Milo, I mean, you guys have worked on some pretty amazing AAA titles. Spider-Man is obviously a game where story is really important. And in many ways, it drove the development of the core mechanics like web slinging, Spidey's acrobatic fighting style. What was the process of marrying story with gameplay on a title like that?
So actually, neither Milo nor I were there for the development of the base game. We both came in for the DLC. So Milo and I, Milo worked much more on Miles than I did, and I worked a lot on the City That Never Sleeps DLC. So a lot of the heavy lifting had already been done at that point. But I can tell you that it was really that process really revolved around finding their version of Peter. And this is something that maybe everyone in here who's worked with IP can talk about a little bit as well. But when you're working with established characters or IP holders, there are so many more stakeholders than just the lead writer who get a say in what the game is and what those characters are, because that's the thing that makes games different, I think, especially when it comes to storytelling than comics or novels, which are primarily focused on story as like the main thing that they deliver. Games have to be fun. They need to feel fun first. And there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of people working on this thing, and there are people pouring millions of dollars into it. So all of those stakeholders have to be convinced that you're doing the right thing. And when you're working with IP, we're not only talking about, you as a writer, then you have your lead writer, but then you have the game director, and then you have the creative director of the game, and then you have the chief creative officer, whatever other random bullshit titles they've made up for people at the studio, and then you have the studio head, but then you also have the people at your publisher, so the Sony guys or the Microsoft guys, and then in IP you also have the Marvel guys, and like all those guys who are rightfully protective of the thing that they own and that they want to make sure that you're getting right. And so there's just so much input and so many people who care because you're making something so big and so risky because they're putting so much money into it. Like, I worked on Anthem, man, I get it. Like, you know what I mean? It's a hard thing. And so I know that on Spider-Man, they worked really long and really hard, both internally at the studio and with Marvel as a stakeholder, to make sure that Peter was pitch perfect. And then that led them into the development of such a wonderful story. And I can say that because I didn't work on it, so no ego here, but like such an amazing story on that base game. That's my sort of take on how they develop something so good.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I only worked on Miles Morales actually as a writing intern. So a lot of what I worked on was open world and like emergent content, not really directly touching the golden path. But like I saw like all of that from the outside, like from behind the scenes, just like that is definitely what is going on at Insomniac. I also think that such a huge part that cannot be understated is like the voice actors there and like working with them. Like the voice, Yuri Lowenthal of Peter, he's his vibe in real life. You're like, oh, it's Spider-Man like in real life. It's just this guy. Like here he is. He's like got such an amazing attitude to work with. And I feel like that just like goes so far in a game too. Like not only when you have like great writing and great story, of course, but when you have like great performances of that, it just really takes it, I think, to the next level. I also noticed like so much of what Josh mentioned too, of like narrative and design working together. I worked on a lot of crimes in Miles Morales, and like every single crime and open world mission I'd work on, the first step of that would be sitting next to the designer who was working on that mission, and then him describing like the exact vibe and like all of the gameplay beats and like who was participating in it and like what kind of like, and then me from there figuring out what kind of lines he would need for it and how we could like progress that mission in like a believable but also like rapid way.
Yeah, I guess we can expand on this question to talk about DLC content as well, where, you know, I know Jill, I think you worked on Destiny, where DLC content is really heavy as well. You know, how do you guys use story to onboard players to new mechanics? You know, if there is an established mechanic system and an established character, how can you guys direct people into something new that is there, new skill, new ability, new whatever?
I think generally it's it can be easier with a DLC because you already can trust that players know the world and know the characters and know the base mechanics. So, you know, you're probably not introducing a whole new suite of mechanics. It's often like, you know, a new ability or new features. They're not going to remap the whole controls in a DLC. So it becomes, you know, it's not learning everything all at once. It is much more of like a, okay, you passed this level, this, you know, all this stuff. Now here's a little bit more on top. And so it often becomes about what kind of story you want the player to be able to tell. Like who, do you learn is the character learning a new skill through training? Are they gifted something? Do they earn it? Do they win it? Do they find it? It all, you know, how do you want the player to feel about the new abilities, and how do you want them to integrate those abilities into their tool set of role-playing abilities? Because every move, every like combat thing, every button on the controller is a tool in the player's role-playing repertoire. Whether the player actively thinks of themselves as a role player or not, those are the tools by which the player and the character that the player is playing interact with the world.
I love that you tied it back to role playing, because that's really what it's all about, right? Like we're living in these little virtual worlds as characters and learning and using the tools that are introduced. I think one of the things when I think about DLC content, that's really cool to me is how like those new features become a way that the world grows, and even if you don't have like something that's super plot driven, right? Like the transformation of your world, adding new features is inherently like a way to tell new stories, right? Like that almost becomes a character, right? Like your world changes become a character that you can use to tell stories in the game, and to help the player feel like, oh, like I'm helping to change things, or things have changed around me and I've experienced something new, and to help inform their experience. That's pretty neat. Yeah.
It also makes me think about our earlier discussion about plot as well with DLC, because like in a sort of traditional 3-act structure, like the main character will have something that they want versus something that they need, that they then ultimately get by the end of the movie, right? Or at least the trilogy of movies. And then it's kind of like, well, is the story over? Where does this character go from here? The challenge in something more long form, like a 60-hour game or even a TV show or lots of other things that are, but you have so much more of a long tail immersion in as a player, reader, experiencer. It's the challenge of finding something that you want to give players like buttons, like endpoints, the feeling of like something is being wrapped up, but also still leave it open enough so that there's always more stories to tell in this universe.
Really, really interesting. And I think we're kind of knocking on the door of a specific topic that you guys have been really, I think you guys have been using it in your vocabulary as you're talking about it, which is tools to tell the story within games. And I want to know, what's your go-to storytelling tool that you love to use? Because there's tons within games and lots of different options. Some people may not even realize that they're being that they're experiencing it. But I'm just kind of curious, what's your go-to tool?
For me, my favorite thing as an environment artist is environmental storytelling. I really like that sense of immersion or verisimilitude, where you feel like you're in a world that things have happened before you're there and things will happen after you leave, and you're just like experiencing this slice of time, and that environment makes you feel that the world around you is real. I think that's the part of the equation that I love to bring, but I equally recognize how important, character setup and motivations and all that stuff is. And yeah, like I said before, ideally those two things are like going hand in hand. In the case of Ico, literally hand in hand.
Yeah. I think for me, one of my favorite things is the gear strings. I think that's like, I play lots of games. I grew up playing Dark Cloud, Final Fantasy, love Destiny, but like all of those games, I think did a really good job of telling stories with the collectibles, right? And just a sentence or two about a sword, right? That it's like, oh man, this sword like has had a life before me, and that kind of stuff is really cool to me. I think that it goes hand in hand with what Josh was talking about, the environmental storytelling, because it's like these artifacts have lived here and been here. In Zelda, you can forge new weapons, and that's cool too, right? I love that stuff. I mean, it's awesome.
I feel like something that's also maybe not underutilized, but maybe I just love to see it and like experience it. But I guess small interactions with the world that leave a permanent change, I think, is really interesting. Like you mentioned Zelda. I think there are a lot of tiny little side quests in Zelda you can do. Like in Link's Awakening, there's like a little ghost, and you can like show it home to like the home it like died in, and like it gets its little memories back and everything. And then from there, it like has its memories, and then that's just like someone who you can see in the world, and like I don't know, someone whose narrative you've changed as a player, maybe not like as part of the Golden Path, but as something that fills out the world. As like, not only is this like a place that has existed before you, but like the people there are just not like, the people there don't revolve around you. Like they have their own little things that happened like before you were starting to interact with it. I think it can create something very special for a player.
Cool. I have a really interesting question around games as a service and how they've changed storytelling. Sam, you mentioned you've sunk way too many hours in Apex. Charles, you're working on Blankos, which has story elements outside of the game. How has games as a service kind of changed the way that you guys tell stories? And how do you tell a story outside of the game? What's that process look like?
It's interesting. I feel like the question in games at every studio I go to is, how do we make games as a service online multiplayer game with a story as compelling as Jedi Fallen Order or Mass Effect? And I don't think anyone has been able to satisfactorily answer that question so far. I honestly think that is the biggest wall in games right now that we're all trying to crack. I think people have come really close. I think Jill on Bungie with Destiny is a wonderful example of that. in terms of doing a really good job of trying to get like a single player story into like a multiplayer experience. And I think that, you know, there are games like Apex, which I love, that focus largely on character and character relationships as opposed to like a linear moving plot. But the question of how to like merge like a true single player story into that sort of games as a service multiplayer thing is, it is like the biggest question in the industry right now. It's a thing that everybody wants to solve. That's like the golden nugget in the sky that people are like, if we could crack that, we'll sell 20 million copies. And like, I don't have the answer for it, and I don't know anybody else who has the answer for it yet, but someone will figure it out. For now, my favorite games as a service are like Apex, where it's all about the characters, but that is like a personal thing for me because I'm such a character person. So I love that it has opened up the opportunity to do like Apex does comics in game, Overwatch does comics outside of games. I think Overwatch and Blizzard do an amazing job of the short films, giving their characters like a little bit of backstory. That stuff I really love, but that again is because I'm a person who basically only cares about character and just wants to know if a Watson and Caustic have like a cute dad-daughter relationship, and then I'm like happy for weeks or whatever. So I don't know. It's hard. It's a hard thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sam hit it on the head. Like, we don't have the answer. I think that she spoke to some really great examples. Again, the Overwatch, Destiny, Apex, all of them have done work with comics that, you know, sit adjacent to or within the narrative frameworks of the game. One of the things that and again, I'm scared. I'm almost nervous to give out my answer, because if this is the golden nugget, maybe I should keep it for myself. But one of the things that I've been really interested in and thinking a lot about is we talked about a little bit earlier is world changes, right? Like those opportunities, and kind of touching on what Milo said as well. Like when players, either as individuals or as a group, have the opportunity to introduce changes to the world and to help bring online new features, like that feels kind of the fallout from that. It feels like those big moments that you might get in a single player campaign, right? But like it has lasting effect that influences how everyone else plays the game. And those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in experimenting with, you know, more and more as I continue to work in games. Because I think that there's something there. There's that's how we live life, right? Like what I do today is going to affect the life of my wife and my daughters and the people in my social circle, and there's no erasing that, right? So like experimenting with that in games is I think there's some cool fodder there for us to work with.
Yeah, building off of that, that is very much what we were trying to accomplish in Guild Wars 2. We launched in 2012, and immediately we were trying to say, how do we change the world in ways that the players feel engaged with and interacting with? And some of the most interesting stories, I would say, that fell out of that were not the plot that we wrote, but rather the emergent things that came about of the mechanics that we provided. A really like just blew my mind story was the main city that we had. All these catastrophes were on the horizon and coming towards it, and we had these whales that were beaching because it's a coastal town, and so we had these beached whales, and we felt sad about that once we put them there. We're like, players should be able to do something about this. So we put little buckets of water, and you could pick up the bucket and splash it on the whale. And did that accomplish anything? No, but it became this whole like community event where everyone was like keeping a vigil of splashing water on these whales. And that was a story that meaningfully impacted people and kept them engaged. And it was just like such a random little like one-off quirky thing that we did, right? So I think as a medium, we're going to discover more and more of these things in our toolkit to be able to build something that works towards that.
I think for me, I love when the community takes your guys' work and creates their own story, right? They create their own narrative backstory, or they ship two characters, or they, you know, build something off of a tiny little nugget in game that you guys have created. That's what I love to see. You know, I've seen it on games I worked on, like Star Wars: The Old Republic, you know, Rainbow Six, and and Assassin's Creed, it happens time and time and time again, where the community will take your amazing work and expand on it and build on it. What do you guys think of when you see that, when you see the community building on something that you've created?
That's how you know you're doing the right thing, I think. I sometimes think of games writing and games narrative design as creating toys for the players. Like, if you create some characters and you go, it's kind of like saying, here are my dolls, please play with my dolls. They have this many lines that they can say, and these outfits. One of my favorite things I saw in the Destiny community was that, so it's a story of like, you play as a guardian who's like a resurrected human who died long ago. And one person, just like one post on a forum was like, I headcanon that my character is the resurrected Abraham Lincoln. And I was like, awesome. Yes. There's nothing in the game to like directly support that. I don't think we even had the right like beard features, but just leaving the opportunity for players to insert themselves, leaving the like gaps for the player to come in and play.
That's super awesome. We're running out of time here, so I want to just hit on one more question. Where do you guys see the future of narrative design in games going? What are some trends that you guys are following that you are implementing in your own games, or that you want to implement in the future, or that you want to see in the future? Where are we going as an industry? Yes.
More dating simulators for me personally. Yeah. I think if BioWare just put out like a hardcore dating sim, they would make $1 billion.
Love Dream Daddy.
Easy win, baby. but that's just me.
Actually, so building off of that, I've never played a dating simulator, but oh my God, have I been loving Hades. And I think what's really exciting about what that game is doing is it manages to asynchronously deliver plot, as in like the A happens, then B happens, and C happens, but it's like separated from the core gameplay loop. But the gameplay loop is what feeds your ability to progress the plots on multiple fronts with these other characters, which is like, so you still feel motivated to continually go out and play the game, and that is providing your narrative context for it without doing the thing that so many other games do, which is like, oh, we have to deliver a plot, therefore we're going to put cutscenes in and the linear edited narrative side of things. So yeah, I'm really excited by that. I think that holds a lot of promise in the future for games.
I love AR stuff. Pokemon Go, when that very first came out, my wife and I were still in New York, and we'd go to the park every single night and just be out there. Like that was our walk home from Midtown all the way up to Harlem, literally through the entire park, just like doing this. So like more of that stuff that's more immersive, where I can go and play games, but be out in the world too. Like I think that there's some exciting things coming with that. And if not, I'm gonna make them. So.
I love that. I remember so clearly like walking along the beach in LA and people like surging into the water to catch a Blastoise that summer and stuff. And I think that like to both of your points as well, I just want to give a serious answer and say that like the worst narrative that I've heard over the last couple of years is this idea that like single player is dead and games as service is the only way to make a financially sustainable game for studios. Games like Jedi Fallen Order prove that that is not true. There is a huge market for single player experiences out there still. And I say this as someone who loves multiplayer games. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to like bring them down or anything, but I also love single player games. And I just think that like there is an infinite amount of disk space out there. Like we can make all these different types of games for everyone, and that includes single player games. And I hope that the industry stops sort of like chasing, maybe it's too much to ask, but chasing these fads and just let studios do what they're good at. Just let them do what they are good at, whatever that may be.
Agreed.
Cool. Anything else, Jill?
I think that we are just like the medium is still figuring itself out. Like whenever, my instinct is always look to the past, and people want to know, like, look to the future, right? Like a lot of early games borrowed a lot from film, which is not illogical, right? That is sort of the closest analog. Early film if you watch like 20s films, they look silly to us because the actors are doing stage acting. They're not doing, you know, they're still performing theater as opposed to like learning the new visual language of like the more intimate view of a camera. And I think video games has a bit of that going on. And also what I would mostly love to see is to start thinking of different genres of games almost as different mediums unto themselves, because they all have different rules and languages. Like something that works for a single player game might or might not be something that works for a game as a service for a long tail game. Like, you know, if you ask a question about like, you know, cutscenes, good or bad, like, well, what's the game you're talking about? What are you making? What's the goal? Like the different, every, you know, there's tools are not universal. Tools only work if they are applied to a problem that tool can fix or help to fix. So, you know, I almost just like, you know, video games is almost, I think sometimes it's almost too broad that you know, there are very few, at least narrative rules or guidelines that are a one size fit all for all video games.
Beautifully said. Great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much to this amazing panel. It's been a treat for me hearing you guys talk.
Thank you, Justin. You were a great moderator.
Oh, thanks, guys.
Yay, Justin.
Yeah, thanks. You know, and thank you to all the wonderful people at WonderCon at home for spending your time with us today. If we could just do a quick roundtable of you know, where people can find you and what you're working on, if you can say, and let people know, you know, how to contact you.
Same order as last time?
Yeah, let's do the same order.
Yeah. Sam Eggs, just my name, 2 M's, 2 G's on Instagram and Twitter. I'm currently working for Activision and some other studios on stuff I can't talk about yet, as well as Scavengers at Midwinter, which is a new multiplayer game as a service. So very excited about that. I've come up with some fun characters, and please buy my new book, Tell No Tales, if you like gay pirates, which I do. So cool.
Hey, gay pirates.
Yeah.
I'm also on Twitter, just my name, Jill Scharr, and I'm working on an unannounced project next.
Yeah, my Twitter is in my Zoom name, I think, and I'm also working on an unannounced project, but it'll be there.
All the secrets.
Eventually, all the secrets. I'm dying. Please tell me.
You guys, I have 0 secrets. So you can find me on Twitter at Joshua Foreman. I have a YouTube channel where I teach art and design, lots of sculpting and fun stuff like that. I also Twitch stream twice a week. So Josh Foreman on Twitch. Yeah, and again, there it is. Buy my book, The Scarred King. It's on Amazon. Sequel's coming out in a month or 2.
I'm Charles Beacham. You can find me on Twitter at CL Beacham. And I am writing Blanco's Block Party, really cool blockchain game that we have coming out from Mythical. Well, it's actually out in beta right now. You can go and create an account and play right now.
Fun, you guys. It's seriously fun. We have a blast.
And you can make your own levels and play with your friends, and it's super awesome. And you know, come play with Josh and I, and hopefully all of our other friends here who are gonna go and make accounts too. And just look out for me on the internets. I'm working on other things as well. I'm working on my first novel right now. Very, very, very early days, but yeah, look out for that.
Awesome. Once again, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today. And we hope you guys at home have a wonderful WonderCon at home, and we, you know, just enjoy the show, enjoy all the content that's coming out for this event. But we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.